Viewers from Canada today asked the question on the channel, why is the Canadian Travel Recommendations website from the government giving such a harsh rating, a level 3, to Nicaragua when everything you see from the show here and other people's channels as well show a country that is safe and welcoming and no particular problems, and life seems to be pretty decent? There doesn't seem to be a need to be concerned more than usual about traveling to Nicaragua, and yet Canada gives a pretty strong warning about it and several neighboring countries. Well, that's something we're going to be answering right after the bell. So first thing, thank you to my viewers who jumped right in and started linking to and referencing some of my old videos that do cover this topic pretty closely. Really appreciate people getting in while I'm out of the office and able to get people that information right away. That is fantastic. We have such a good community here. It's really wonderful. But I'm Scott Allen Miller. I've been living in Nicaragua for on and off for the last 10 years continuously for more than 4, and I am a full resident here now. And this is a question or topic that comes up pretty often, not so much directly from Canada, but just in a general sense. Lots of countries give warnings about Nicaragua, and it's important to understand a few things. We do have a video that we made last year, I believe, talking about the U.S. State Department and why the State Department, one, has no mandate to give you correct information, and why it is standard in many State Department type ministerial positions to give questionable guidance when it comes to travel around the world. And the bottom line is government departments like this are there for the purpose of the government in most cases, not for the purpose of the people. Now, sometimes those things align, and rarely are they going to give you completely reckless guidance, right? They're not going to generally suggest you go to a war zone and just take a vacation on the beach there. They're going to be like, no, that's dangerous, don't go there. But the risk is that places that are relatively safe or very safe, they may come up with reasons, often ones that are very difficult to prove, to say, oh, you should not go there. We give this warning. Of course, you're allowed to go, but I wouldn't, right? And they give you this kind of feel. And I want to tell a quick story. I was here with one of our viewers, I think it was 2 years ago. He and his wife have been travelers both here and several places in the region a number of times. They love the area. His wife had decided to stay home. They had grandkids and she didn't want to leave them. So he was doing some traveling on his own. He had started, I believe, in Costa Rica, working his way up to Nicaragua, where he's spending lots of time. He had been here a lot, was a major viewer of the show. And so he really knew Nicaragua, and his wife didn't have the slightest concern about coming to Nicaragua. Of course it's safe. She knew it was safe. She'd been here, no problem at all. But he wanted to go up to El Salvador, which, as we all know, is now safer than Canada. Some people are saying Nicaragua is safer than Canada. I'm not buying that. That is quite a stretch. Nicaragua is in a great position. We're a very safe country. But the amount that Nicaragua would have to get safer and the amount that Canada would have to get more dangerous for that particular flip to happen, outside of like during the pandemic, yes, it did. But that was a very momentary thing with a very clear explanation as to why. We don't expect it actually to be true. I think Nicaragua is approaching Canada's safety. I think Canada is approaching Nicaragua's safety. I'm sure they will come together in the next few years. That seems to be the trend. But to think that Nicaragua made that much of a leap, or Canada made that much of a fall, all in the past year, would be very difficult to believe. It's not impossible. There are reasons explanations that make this make sense. A lot of people have put out ideas as to why Canada may be a lot more dangerous. Nicaragua has not taken a huge leap forward in safety, but we are consistently every year just a tiny bit safer than the year before. We're already a really safe country, right? We're safer on average than the United States, which is actually a pretty safe country in the general sense. That may be changing now, but for a long period of time, the U.S. has done pretty well as far as we're referring to violent crime here. Nicaragua is by far the best in the region. It's not quite the best in all of Latin America, but it's definitely the best in northern Latin America, meaning from about mid-South America all the way north. No one is as safe as Nicaragua traditionally. Again, El Salvador took a really big leap from last place to first place and is kind of a really important story, but it's its own animal, and you have to understand that it's a very temporary thing, and we're going to see how their society settles in and what long-term safety looks like there. But so it's just important to contextualize. Nicaragua is very safe. Canada is traditionally incredibly safe, but there's a lot of Canadians who truly believe that Canada's safety has slipped dramatically. However, that gives us so in this story, right? So they're in Canada, she's in Canada, he's in Nicaragua. They know Nicaragua's safe. They know, she has no question about El Salvador. No one can make a claim that El Salvador isn't safe right now, especially for travelers. And so she had no problem with him being in El Salvador. But at the time, the ferry between Nicaragua and El Salvador had not started yet. Now there is a ferry, Gecko Tours, I believe is what it's called, operates a lancha that goes from the port of Potosí to the port of La Union in El Salvador, and you can go by boat, and it looks really interesting. I really want to do it on the show and like film the boat ride and show you guys what it's like crossing the Gulf of Fonseca, and it bypasses Honduras, which the real reason to bypass Honduras is that is a border check you can just skip. So instead of driving to the east, going through Honduras, coming back west to go into El Salvador, having an extra border crossing, and Honduran's border is known for being kind of mayhem, so it's not the smoothest, fastest border. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not a great one as far as just the logistics of getting across. I have done it on my own where I had to do everything myself, and it's very ambiguous as to what steps you're supposed to do in what order. You really have to kind of wander around and be like, hey, I just did this, what do I do next? Like, it's not clear. Whereas I have also done it on a bus, and it took a while, lots of lines, but it was smooth. But what Canada did was issue a really strong warning about Honduras, not about El Salvador, and his wife knew to ignore the warnings about Nicaragua. So when she was looking at Nicaragua, she knew the information was false. She knew that the Canadian travel advisory system was not there giving correct information. So even armed with that knowledge, she read what they claimed were the dangers in Honduras. And to be clear, Honduras is a much more dangerous country than any of the ones around it. It does pose some travel risks. You do need to be savvy and aware and know what you're doing. But it's also important to understand that the, Roatan and Utila and like the islands in the Caribbean are incredibly safe. And the corridor between Nicaragua and El Salvador is incredibly safe. It is known as a travel corridor and a beachfront. It's the only Pacific beachfront. For Honduras, it's mostly a tourist zone and a travel zone. And you can really travel it quite safely. I have no concerns about going through that corridor. And but his wife, even knowing how it works with Nicaragua, was so influenced by that statement about Honduras as a general entity that she would not allow him to travel from Nicaragua to El Salvador. So Canada was effectively able to curtail travel to El Salvador by making a claim that was very difficult to substantiate about Honduras. And they didn't have to make a claim that all of Honduras was dangerous. They only had to categorize Honduras itself as a level 3 danger for traveling, and someone knowledgeable was unable to emotionally get past the fear generated by that statement. So you can just imagine how effective this would be if a country wanted its people to be afraid of going somewhere. Of course, someone's going to go. Someone's always going to go. Someone's like me and adventurous and doesn't care. It's not even going to look at those sites. And if they said it was dangerous, I'd be like, I bet they're safe because they said it, right? I'm so contrarian, and my experience has been so contrarian with what those sites say that I would actually be encouraged. I want to go out of my way to prove how safe it is, because this is such a ridiculous set of circumstances that keeps coming up. But the average person, and remember, with governments, everything comes down to math. So when governments are doing this, they know they're not going to stop every single person from traveling. That's not what they care about. What they care about is changing the pace, the rate, the frequency with which their citizens, their people, go and visit that country and interact with them financially, how much they contribute to their economy. And it can be that they are picking countries like Nicaragua that they want to discourage economic development in, or it could also be that there are other countries like Costa Rica that they want to encourage travel in and financial economic development. And so it can be, well, in order to get people into country A, we're going to make country B sound bad, and we're not going to say anything about country A, and people will naturally go that way. Or it could be we want people to avoid country B, and we'll just make country A sound safe and say bad things about country B, and people will naturally go that way. And many of the things that they say are very difficult to substantiate, right? They will say things like, oh, risk of wrongful detention. Well, how do you know what's wrongful detention? right? In many cases, it's a gray area. In the United States, we know that wrongful detention is a major fear in day-to-day life. I've not had that fear in Nicaragua. Of course, every country has somebody who's wrongfully detained, right? There's always some percentage of wrongful detention. Even in very safe Canada, even in super safe Germany and Italy, there's somebody who gets arrested by mistake. They're mistaken for someone else. They're wearing the same clothes and pass someone on the street, and they get caught in the camera crossfires. For one reason or another, someone is always wrongfully detained. The question is not, can it happen? The question is, what rate of people who existing in human days within a country, at what pace is there this risk? And is it, if you're there for, you know, 1,000,000 days, it happens once? If you're there for 100,000 days, does it happen once? If you're there for 100 days, does it happen once? Those are the kind of statistics that would be meaningful from that. But we have two problems. One is no one's collecting those statistics. And two, even those statistics would be somewhat arbitrary because, for example, we have the story that everyone likes to bring up about the Canadian family who was detained in San Juan del Sur for a car accident. Now, someone did die. We've done analysis on it. We have good videos. She has good videos about it. Everything that I've done in my analysis is just going through her videos and pulling out relevant bits for people who did not follow her story or were missing context for it to really understand what she was telling. And but in that case, right, he was in an accident. He was not at fault. And it is standard process here in Nicaragua. If you're a foreigner and you're at a high flight risk, which most foreigners are naturally, and there is a death or grave injury in an accident, until such time as they know who's at fault, you spend a little bit of time in jail. Is that wrongful detention? No, that is not arbitrary or wrongful detention. That is how the law works. It's very straightforward. I'm not saying that we love that law. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be changed or should be changed or should be kept or anything. I'm just saying that that is a rightful detention. It is not that he was in the wrong. He did everything right, as far as we know, and he should have been held for up to 2 days, 48 hours, in order to determine that he did do everything right. He's not going to jail. He's not going to prison. He's not getting a record. He's not getting charged with anything. He's not paying a penalty, nothing like that. It's just a hold to make sure he doesn't flee while they determine what's going on. Now, in that case, there was a further detention at his family's request that he agreed to because there was a misunderstanding and they were scammed by a lawyer or a person pretending to be a lawyer. It may have been layers of scam, right? The onion of scam. But in that case, most people will look at it and be like, that was wrongful detention. But when you actually look at the case, it was not. But in many cases, if someone has an accident and they do get in trouble, they do spend time in jail, all they have to do is say, oh, I didn't really do that thing. Then their government has to decide how to treat that. Are they going to record that as an arbitrary detention? Or are they going to accept that the courts locally decided that someone was at fault and detain them because they had actually committed a crime? That the idea of wrongful detention in some cases is very straightforward, and we know this from cases in the United States. We watch so many in the news all the time. This person's been in prison for X number of years. It turns out there was never any crime that they committed. But there's problems in the US, like it's common law, so they can change the law after the fact. Well, he's been in jail for 20 years. At the time, it wasn't against the law, but we don't want him to have been wrongfully imprisoned, so we're going to retroactively make it have been illegal 20 years ago, and they're allowed to do that. They don't do that very often, but they are allowed to do that. Those powers exist. Other places don't have that kind of legal system, and so it's different how we can perceive what is and isn't arbitrary detention. But the question of can you be detained simply for how you look or your religion or something like that in the United States, that is a real fear. And in Nicaragua, that is not a real fear. I've never heard even a hint of a rumor that something like that had happened in Nicaragua. That is not to say that it never has happened. That is impossible to happen. But the idea of it would be shocking to Nicaraguans, but the idea of it would be a normal fear to minorities in America. So it's a very different place to be. Yet, what the reason we're mentioning this is that when you look at the Canadian recommendation websites, maybe now this has changed in the recent weeks, but up until recently, Canada generally gave the United States a pass on the things that they consider very dangerous in other countries, right? The risk of violence, the risk of uprising, the risk of wrongful detention or arbitrary detention in other countries, they'll point out as it could happen. They're not saying it does happen. They're not saying that it's likely to happen. They're just saying it could happen. Well, it could happen anywhere, right? It could happen on the moon. Right? You're the one person on the moon, someone else shows up and incarcerates you, and it wasn't your fault, you didn't do anything wrong. There's not even laws on the moon. What would that even mean? And yet it could happen. So what do? Do you just say, well, the moon, things could go wrong? That's a meaningless system. That's one of the reasons that they word things the way that they do. It's very hard to come back and be like, you said, and then prove something. They say, no, it could happen, right? So they use these terms that are very fungible, that are very ambiguous, and it really just works for guiding people in one direction or another. In general, my recommendation is not to go to these websites. They are there repeatedly, we find, for the purpose of misleading you. In some cases, there are governments that take this seriously and actually go out and do research and try to compile good information for their citizens. That does exist. What we know for fact is that the US and Canada are not those countries. In many cases, Canada has traditionally simply put more or less whatever the United States has put. If the US does not want to encourage traffic to a country, they will put one thing and Canada will generally mirror it. Not 100% of the time, but much of the time. And so we see a bit of this from Europe, but we also see contrarian views from Europe. Countries in Europe sometimes will post exactly the opposite thing, which also isn't necessarily correct, right? The risk is that they're just taking a different opinion as to what they want to promote and not promote, but not actually evaluating countries based on how safe they are or whatever. If you were truly going to do that, you would not use a State Department website. That would not be a good reference. Any government would not be good on that unless you're talking about risks to specific people. Oh, it's a safe country, but Americans are specifically, Canadians are specifically targeted. Okay, that would be a different equation. That's something you might need a warning about. That is certainly not something that is happening here or much of anywhere. There are places in the world where that's real fear and you need to be worried about that. So those could be good guidelines, although in most of those cases you already know that stuff. But when it comes to general guidance, you want to be looking at things like statistics, and this is much more meaningful when you're looking at violent crime statistics. And again, there are countries that have none, and there are situations where it's difficult to determine what the risks are. For example, in Canada, they delay their statistics by a number of years, and a number of people have pointed out that the statistics may not be accurate as it is. So, you know, that's always a fear. But most of the countries in the world do report violent crime statistics, and when you look at those, and they also report things like kidnappings and those sorts of things, and generally they break it down by region within their countries. You can look at those numbers, and that's really meaningful. That's something we've done on the channel before, not globally, but we've done it for like across Latin America as an example. And breaking down all the countries in Latin America and comparing different countries to each other is really useful. So things like when people say, well, Paraguay is really safe, we can say, well, what does really safe mean? And then we look at the numbers and say, oh, it's basically identical to Nicaragua. If anything, it squeaks in as just the tiniest bit safer from a violent crime, but it's almost identical. And that's a really meaningful comparison. You can say, well, Nicaragua's crazy safe, so Paraguay must be crazy safe too. And if a country is safer than those, you go, wow, that's really impressive. That's an incredibly safe country. And if something is twice or three times the violent crime rates of those, right, 300% the violent crime, it gives you something to say, okay, well, that was really safe. Is 3 times so bad that I wouldn't travel there? And the reality is that 3 times the violent crime of Nicaragua or Paraguay isn't so bad that any normal person would be concerned about it. But this is what gets interesting, is if you look at places like Canada and the United States, they're fine with you traveling to places like the United States or Costa Rica, both of which have higher violent crime than Nicaragua. The United States has a high risk of arbitrary detainment. Costa Rica does not. Costa Rica has very normal detainment, right? If you break the law, you'll get arrested, but if you don't, you probably won't. So if you're looking at it from a violent crime perspective, Costa Rica being 3 times the violent crime rate of the US, Nicaragua, or Paraguay, you would think that that would cause it to get a pretty strong warning. If you were looking at the United States and saying, well, arbitrary detention is something that Canada cares about, so they should be giving a strong warning about that. But in most cases, at least traditionally, Canada gave both of those countries a free pass. But Nicaragua, even today, is given a harsh rating based on things that it does better than the places that are being given a pass on it. So especially at 1/3 the violent crime of Costa Rica, which is fine, right? Costa Rica shouldn't be a place that you're that concerned about. Sure, you should be a little bit wary. Yes, pay attention. No, don't be a foolish traveler and, you know, be oblivious and leave money hanging out of your pocket, wear gold chains as you go through dark neighborhoods in the barrio at night. Don't be foolish. But also, don't be afraid of going to a place at that crime level, because you're probably not going to put yourself in a position as a tourist to be in the crossfire, so to speak, of whatever criminal element there is. Is there risk? Of course, but there's risk anywhere. Your behavior is generally a bigger protective force than other things, right? Put yourself in safe situations and you will be safe. Put yourself in dangerous situations, even in the safest of countries, and you will be in danger. And let's face it, in Canada, even if the violent crime from people is low, if you go to the wrong place and fool around, a polar bear will eat you. So one way or another, there's always something to worry about that you probably, in most cases, can control. So that's really the view of why Canada is giving this misinformation. Canada and Nicaragua are not on friendly terms right now. They're maybe a little bit friendlier than they have been in the past, now that the United States and Canada are on less friendly terms than they have been. A lot of things in that sense are being shaken up worldwide, so don't be surprised if you see a lot of geopolitical shifts as countries decide how to take a different view of each other, and countries that maybe are less traditionally friendly or aligned, maybe looking at themselves as having shared external concerns that may bring people closer together in the future. But very importantly, there is no country in Latin America that I would be concerned about travel to. There is none that have the same danger as, for example, Belize, and very few people are ever concerned about Belize, and yet they're the most dangerous in the entire region, except for, of course, Haiti, which goes without saying, I hope. And yet I travel to Belize, and yeah, I'm a little bit more vigilant when I'm walking around, but you see me, I walk around with a camera. It's a very nice place. There's no reason not to go there, just pay a little bit more attention. It's also important to note, like we said with the corridor in Honduras, yes, there are parts of Honduras that are quite dangerous, and if you're going to go to Honduras, you should do some research and be aware of what you're doing. But you can also go to Honduras almost obliviously in many cases and never leave a tourist zone, because naturally tourists don't, and be completely safe and never have to worry about the fact that Honduras does have statistically some crime problems. And I say some, it has a lot. If you're coming to places like Nicaragua, we have the same thing. Even if there were situations, even if there were places where the crime was high enough, the violent crime was a risk enough that you wanted to avoid those areas. In most cases, you're going to avoid them anyway. You're going to be doing touristy or expat-y things. You're going to be going to San Juan del Sur. You're going to be going to downtown Granada. You're going to be going to León out here. You're going to go up to Esteli and take a tour of the cigar factories. You're going to go to Matagalpa and hang out in the mountains and go get coffee and stuff. You're going to do things. You're going to go to Ometepe, right, and hang out on the beaches. All those things are very, very safe. They're touristy, and there's a lot of protections around that, and a lot of other people doing that all the time without problem. And so even if there is a spot that people feel is more dangerous, right, going into Barrio Venezuela in Managua, for example, which I still don't hold is being very dangerous, but we'll give them a little bit of credit that it's at least more dangerous than some of the touristy areas. Like anywhere, understanding that there are very safe parts of the country and more dangerous parts of the country, just like the United States. You can go to parts of the United States that are incredibly safe, and you can go to parts of the United States that are incredibly dangerous. It is not incredibly useful to look at the statistics of an entire country. You have to look at what applies to what you're doing. If you're looking at Mexico, the statistics seem pretty scary. And if you're going to someplace like Cancun, it plays out. It is terrifying. But there's tons of central Mexico that is very safe, even though statistically there's a bit of a crime problem in the country. Whenever you have a country large enough to have different regions, you're going to have this separation, this oil and water of safe and dangerous. And so looking at advisories at a national level, unless you have such a small country, you know, Andorra or something like that. Even Belize, I guess, is small enough that you could look kind of at a full country, because like Belize as a country is only the size, a little bit bigger than León as a city. Okay, we can start to use those numbers to say, okay, Belize has this level of danger. But when you're looking at Nicaragua or United States, saying this is the danger across the entire country is almost useless. You only care about what the danger is in the situations that you'll actually be in. So when we're looking at this, importantly, Nicaragua is safe. The State Department and similar ministerial websites and resources from nearly all countries are effectively useless. Look at statistics to get a general sense of what the safety is across broad society. So I encourage you to get out and use your resources that are available to you as best as you can. Of course, some of that is just using common sense and looking into statistics. Some is using YouTube channels and websites like this one, where we actually show the country and have long-term views use, not just one person traveling through, and especially be careful of people who are not actually in a country, who aren't really showing what's going on, who may be incredibly clueless and not being able to interpret what is around them, or are just passing through. Famously, there is one where some people claim to be detained because they brought in a drone, but really I think they were just sitting in a aduana like anyone normally would while they're working out what they owe in taxes. And it's not detained. I guess it is slowed down in a sense from going on to your travels, but it is a normal part of the border crossing. And of course, they didn't do their basic research and didn't know which things they needed to bring to a country, and so put themselves in a position of just being idiots and not providing good information to people. Things that you could look up in a few seconds and know that you shouldn't bring drones to Nicaragua, for example, would solve a lot of problems. They didn't do the most minimal research. They didn't watch any videos. They didn't talk to anybody. They didn't ask any questions and just assumed that they could just do whatever, right? It's a very common thing with affluent travelers to think that they can just get away with anything. And I understand that a lot of places allow drones, and it may at some point become something that is second nature to you to bring, and you don't think anything about it, and that can totally be understood. But it's also important that so many travel vloggers make their audience by being really, just putting on spam bait, clickbait titles, and being overly dramatic and acting like the normal media. And yeah, the algorithm rewards that, sadly. But you have to watch out that so many people are making their money doing that. If you watch these people who visit any country for just a few days, the information that they give, other than the first impressions, that stuff is generally pretty valuable because that's legitimately their first impression. But when they start trying to give guidance, you're often getting really bad guidance because they don't know. They don't know which things they missed. They don't know what things they overlooked. They just don't know how things worked. I was just having a discussion in the Expats group, and someone who'd been here for a long time has so many misconceptions about how so many things work, because there's so many underlying components that they're unfamiliar with, that they're making huge assumptions about what's going on in a country because they just don't understand universal basics about, how currencies work or border controls work or whatever, those kinds of things. It's easy for someone to get really misled. So it's important to look for resources that do have some credibility and aren't just someone giving their quick impression of a place. But with a little bit of work like that and looking at the statistics and understanding, places like Honduras even, which is a little bit more dangerous, still has loads of expats living there, still has many people traveling there. You can look and see what it's like and get a feel and make your own determinations. And yes, sometimes places are a little bit more dangerous, but also ask yourself, is it really a problem? Are you going to be there for so long that that's actually a concern, right? Because remember, real people live in these countries. If they had danger at the levels that people are often trying to claim, it's almost as if no one could live there. And there are places where people can't live, as few and far between. So thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. We also have a community that you can join. This is a monthly membership just to help support the channel on an ongoing basis. We make this content every single day, and that takes a lot of work and time and equipment. I had 2 cameras overheat just while we were doing the videos today. It's 95 degrees out here as I'm doing this, so it is a warm day. But if you want to get down, there's a join button here on YouTube. There's also a membership button on Buy Me a Coffee, or you can just buy me a single coffee or 3 coffees or whatever. And that really does a lot to support the channel. We do have a WhatsApp group for expats of Nicaragua if you're interested in being able to talk directly to loads of people in Nicaragua and getting lots of feedback from people who are mostly real here. Remember, there's nothing that proves that the people in the group actually live here, but a lot of us know each other, and so you can tell pretty quickly who is in the know and actually is all connected to each other versus some random person giving information. So consider joining that. Link is in the show notes. If you need to email me, email is in the show notes. If you want information on my other channels like Nicaragua 360 or Nicaragua, guess what? It's in the show notes. If you would like to send in a video question, I love it when we get these, so please consider doing that. Take a video of yourself, all the instructions on how to do that and how to send it to me in the show notes. If you'd like to just ask a question and you don't want to do that, get down in the comment section, ask a question, just say hello, leave a comment about things, what you've experienced and so forth, safety that you found, places that you're wondering about, whatever. Go ahead and ask away. We love all the interaction we have down there. Of course, we love it when you share us on social media, tell someone about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.